The town of Clearwater had seen its share of hangings, but never one quite like this. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the Texas horizon, a crowd had already gathered in the town square, their faces a mixture of curiosity, bloodlust, and something that might have been shame if any of them had possessed the courage to examine their consciences too closely. At the center of it all stood a hastily constructed gallows, its rough wooden beams still oozing sap from where they'd been nailed together the night before. And beneath the dangling noose, hands bound behind his back with coarse rope, stood a boy who couldn't have been more than 15 years old. His name was Timothy Walsh, though most folks in Clearwater knew him simply as that orphan boy or the Irish kid, depending on their degree of charity. He'd arrived in town 6 months ago on a freight wagon, alone and carrying nothing but the clothes on his back, and a letter from a distant relative who'd promised him work that never materialized. Since then, he'd survived by doing odd jobs, sleeping in barns when the weather was cold, and generally trying to stay invisible in a town that had little use for homeless children. Now he stood accused of murder, and in less than an hour, if the town had its way, he would be dead. Captain James Hawk Morrison of the Texas Rangers had ridden into Clearwater just as the sun began to touch the eastern mountains, drawn by reports of unusual ranger activity in the area. What he found instead was a town preparing to lynch a child based on evidence so thin it wouldn't hold water in a cracked bucket. Morrison was a man carved from the same tough timber as the land he protected. 38 years old, with steel-gray eyes and the kind of weathered face that spoke of countless hours under the relentless Texas sun. He'd been wearing the silver star of the Rangers for 15 years. In that time, he'd faced down rustlers, outlaws, and killers of every description, but he'd never quite gotten used to the casual cruelty that civilized people could inflict on those they deemed expendable. He tied his horse to the hitching post outside Murphy's saloon and walked slowly toward the crowd, his spurs making small musical sounds in the dust. The crowd parted before him instinctively, recognizing the authority in his bearing even before they spotted the ranger badge pinned to his vest. "Morning, folks," Morrison said, his voice carrying easily across the square despite its conversational tone. "Mighty early for a public gathering. What's the occasion?" Mayor Cornelius Blackwood stepped forward, a portly man whose expensive suit couldn't quite disguise the fact that he'd grown prosperous on other people's misfortune. "Captain Morrison, is it? We weren't expecting any rangers in Clearwater. This is a local matter, well within our authority to handle." Morrison's gray eyes swept over the gallows, the bound boy, and the eager faces in the crowd. "Local matter," he repeated thoughtfully. "That what you call it when you're fixing to hang a child without benefit of trial or evidence." "Now see here," Blackwood blustered, his face reddening. "That boy murdered Ezra Hamilton in cold blood. We found him standing over the body with blood on his hands. The evidence is clear as daylight." Morrison walked closer to the gallows, studying Timothy Walsh with the careful attention of a man trained to read character in faces. What he saw was fear, certainly, but also something else, a quiet dignity that refused to be broken even in the face of death. The boy's clothes were patched and worn, his face gaunt from too many missed meals, but his eyes held an intelligence and honesty that spoke well of his character. "Son," Morrison said gently, "what's your name?" "Timothy Walsh, sir," the boy replied, his voice steady despite the tremor Morrison could see in his hands. "And I didn't kill nobody, no matter what they say. Tell me what happened." Timothy glanced nervously at the crowd, many of whom were shouting for him to stop wasting time and get on with the hanging. But something about the ranger's calm presence seemed to give him courage. "I was sleeping in Mr. Hamilton's barn last night, same as I'd done for the past week. He said I could stay there if I helped with the morning chores. Around midnight I heard sounds from the house, like furniture breaking and men shouting. When it got quiet, I went to check if Mr. Hamilton was all right." "And what did you find?" Timothy's voice broke slightly. "He was on the floor of his kitchen, blood everywhere. I knelt down to see if he was still breathing, to see if I could help him. That's when Sheriff Crawford found me." Morrison turned to scan the crowd until he spotted Sheriff Crawford, a man whose badge seemed to weigh heavy on his conscience. "Sheriff, you want to tell me about the investigation you conducted?" Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Captain, it was pretty straightforward. Found the boy standing over Hamilton's body, blood on his hands and clothes. What more investigation do you need? How about looking for signs of forced entry? Checking for missing valuables? Interviewing witnesses? You know, the kind of basic police work they teach in civilized places. Now look here." "Morrison," Mayor Blackwood interrupted, "we don't need some outsider coming in here telling us how to handle our business. This boy's been nothing but trouble since he arrived, begging for handouts, sleeping where he doesn't belong. Everybody knows his kind can't be trusted." Morrison's eyes went cold as winter steel. "His kind? You mean orphans? Poor children? Or are you referring to something else entirely?" The mayor's face reddened further. "I'm talking about vagrants and drifters who bring nothing but problems to decent communities. We've been patient with the boy, but this proves what we've known all along. He's bad blood, and bad blood will always show itself." "Bad blood," Morrison repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. "Interesting theory, Mayor. Tell me, what makes blood bad? Poverty? Circumstances beyond a person's control? Or is it something else that makes you so eager to see a child hang?" Before Blackwood could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Ranger Morrison!" Everyone turned to see a young woman pushing through the crowd, her face flushed with exertion and determination. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair and green eyes that flashed with intelligence and indignation. Morrison recognized her immediately as Sarah Mackenzie, the school teacher who'd arrived in Clearwater a few months after Timothy. "Miss Mackenzie," Morrison said, tipping his hat, "you have something to add to this discussion." "I certainly do," she replied, breathing heavily from her rush to reach the square. "I've been trying to tell these people all morning that they're about to make a terrible mistake. But nobody wants to listen to a woman when they've got blood in their eyes." "We're listening now," Morrison said. "What do you know about last night?" Sarah looked directly at Timothy, her eyes full of compassion and determination. "I know that Timothy Walsh is incapable of murder. I've been tutoring him in reading and writing for the past 2 months, and I've never met a gentler, more honest soul. More importantly, I know he couldn't have killed Mr. Hamilton because he was with me until nearly 11 o'clock last night." The crowd erupted in angry murmurs, but Morrison raised his hand for silence. "Go on, Miss Mackenzie. Timothy's been helping me organize books for the new school library. We worked late because we wanted to finish cataloging the donation from Austin before the school board meeting today. I walked him to the edge of town myself, and it was well past 10:30 when he headed toward Mr. Hamilton's place." "You're lying!" someone in the crowd shouted. "Trying to save your boyfriend." Sarah's face flamed, but her voice remained steady. "I'm telling the truth, and I'll swear to it before God or any court in Texas. Timothy Walsh is innocent of this crime." Morrison studied the faces around him, reading the mixture of doubt and stubborn determination to proceed with the hanging, regardless of new evidence. This was mob justice at its worst, driven more by prejudice and bloodlust than any genuine desire to see the guilty punished. "Sheriff Crawford," Morrison said, his voice carrying the full authority of the Texas Rangers, "I'm placing this boy in protective custody pending a proper investigation of Mr. Hamilton's death." "You can't do that," Mayor Blackwood protested. "This is a local matter, and we have jurisdiction here." Morrison's hand moved casually to rest on the butt of his Colt .45, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the crowd. "Mayor, I can and I will. The Texas Rangers have authority throughout this state, and I'm exercising that authority right now. Anyone who interferes with the performance of my duties will find themselves facing charges more serious than they want to contemplate." He walked over to Timothy and cut the ropes binding the boy's hands with a knife that appeared and disappeared so quickly it seemed like magic. "Son, you're under the protection of the Texas Rangers now. Nobody's going to hurt you." Timothy's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Thank you, sir. I didn't think anybody would believe me." "The truth has a way of making itself known," Morrison replied. "But first we need to find out what really happened to Ezra Hamilton." As Morrison led Timothy away from the gallows, he could hear the angry grumbling of the crowd behind them. These people had come expecting a hanging, and they weren't happy to be disappointed. But Captain James Morrison had spent 15 years standing between the innocent and those who would prey on them. And he wasn't about to let mob justice triumph over real law, especially when the victim was a child with no one else to defend him. The sun was now fully above the horizon, painting the town of Clearwater in shades of gold and amber. It should have been the hour of Timothy Walsh's death, but instead it had become the dawn of something else entirely, the beginning of a real investigation that would uncover the truth. No matter who that truth might inconvenience, Morrison had cut more than just the rope that bound Timothy's hands. He'd cut through the prejudice, fear, and mob mentality that had nearly claimed an innocent life. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone present that real justice wasn't about satisfying bloodlust or eliminating inconvenient people, but about protecting the weak and ensuring that the truth, however uncomfortable, would ultimately prevail. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will touch your heart and inspire your soul. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. The Clearwater jailhouse was a modest stone building that had seen better days, its cells designed more for holding drunken cowboys than protecting innocent witnesses. But it was the safest place Captain Morrison could think of to keep Timothy Walsh while he conducted his investigation into Ezra Hamilton's murder. Timothy sat on the narrow cot in the cell, no longer bound but still technically under arrest for his own protection. Through the barred window, he could see townsfolk gathering in small groups, their angry voices carrying clearly in the morning air. Many were calling for the ranger to mind his own business and let local justice take its course. "Don't pay them any mind, son," Morrison said, settling into the chair beside the cell. "Mobs are like thunderstorms, all noise and fury, but they blow themselves out eventually." "Captain Morrison," Timothy said quietly, "I appreciate what you've done for me, but maybe it would be better if you just let them have their way. I've been on my own so long. Maybe this is just how it's supposed to end." Morrison studied the boy's face, seeing the exhaustion and despair that came from months of struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to grind him down. It was a look he'd seen before, on other young faces in other desperate situations, and it never failed to stir something protective in his chest. "Timothy, let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. The moment you start thinking you don't deserve justice is the moment you give up on everything that makes life worth living. You got as much right to a fair trial and honest investigation as any rich man in this territory." Before Timothy could respond, the jailhouse door opened and Sheriff Crawford entered, followed by Sarah Mackenzie. The lawman's face was grim, while the schoolteacher carried a small basket that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. "Thought the boy might be hungry," Sarah said, setting the basket on Morrison's desk. "And I wanted to thank you, Captain, for stopping that travesty they were calling justice." Morrison nodded his appreciation. "Miss Mackenzie, I need you to tell me exactly what happened last night. Every detail you can remember." Sarah pulled up a chair, her green eyes focused and determined. "Timothy came to the schoolhouse around 7 o'clock. Same as he has every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 2 months. We've been working together to improve his reading and writing skills, and last night we were cataloging books for the new library. Anyone else see him there? Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house brought us some supper around 8:30. She can verify that Timothy was there then." Sarah glanced at Sheriff Crawford, whose face had grown increasingly uncomfortable. "I've already told the sheriff all this, but he didn't seem interested in hearing it." Crawford shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Captain, I know you think I didn't do a proper investigation, but the evidence was pretty clear. Boy had blood on his hands, standing right over the body. Sheriff, Morrison interrupted, when you found Timothy in Hamilton's house, did you notice anything else? Signs of struggle? Missing items? Anything that might indicate what really happened? Well, Crawford admitted reluctantly, there was signs of a fight in the kitchen. Chairs overturned, broken dishes, and Hamilton's cash box was missing from his bedroom. Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. Cash box? You didn't mention that before. Didn't seem important, Crawford mumbled. Figured the boy took it after he killed Hamilton. Did you look for it? Search the area where Timothy had been sleeping? Crawford's silence was answer enough. Morrison stood up, his patience finally exhausted with the sheriff's incompetence. Timothy, how much money did Ezra Hamilton usually keep in that cash box? I don't know exactly, sir, but he told me once it was his life savings. Said he didn't trust banks, kept everything in cash. Probably a few $100s, maybe more. And where did he keep this box? In his bedroom, under the floorboards by his bed? He showed me once, when he was explaining why he was so careful about locking up at night. Morrison turned to Crawford, his grey eyes hard as granite. Sheriff, did it occur to you that if Timothy had stolen several $100s, he probably wouldn't still be sleeping in Hamilton's barn the next morning? That maybe, just maybe, a guilty man would have taken the money and run? Crawford's face reddened. Well, that is, maybe he didn't have time to get away before I found him. Or maybe, Morrison said with dangerous quiet, he didn't take the money because he didn't kill Hamilton. Maybe the real killer took the cash box and left Timothy to hang for the murder. The implications of Morrison's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. If Timothy was innocent, then the real killer was still free, and the town had nearly executed the wrong person. Captain, Sarah said quietly, there's something else. Something I haven't told anyone because I wasn't sure it was important. Morrison turned his full attention to her. What is it, Miss Mackenzie? When I walked Timothy to the edge of town last night, we saw 3 men riding hard toward the Hamilton place. They were moving fast, like they were in a hurry, and they didn't want to be seen. When Timothy asked if we should see what they wanted, I told him it wasn't our business. Can you describe these men? Sarah concentrated, her brow furrowed with effort. It was dark, but there was enough moonlight to see shapes. One was very large, bigger than most men. Another was thin, and sat his horse like he'd been riding all his life. The third, I couldn't make out much about him, except that his horse was wearing silver on its bridle. Fancy tack, the kind a wealthy man would have. Morrison felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. Timothy, did Hamilton have any enemies? Anyone who might want him dead? The boy thought carefully before answering. Not enemies exactly, but there were some men who came by a few weeks ago, wanting to buy his land. Mr. Hamilton told me they got pretty angry when he refused to sell. Said they made threats about what might happen to folks who didn't cooperate with progress. You remember their names? One was called Mr. Vance, I think. Big man with a loud voice. The other was thinner, went by Carson or something like that. But the one doing most of the talking was dressed real fancy, had silver buttons on his vest, and silver spurs on his boots. Morrison exchanged glances with Sarah, both of them thinking about the silver bridle she'd seen the night before. Sheriff, where exactly is Hamilton's land located? Crawford consulted a map on his desk. About 3 miles northwest of town, right in the path of the new railroad spur they're planning to build. Prime real estate, if you're looking to profit from the railroad boom. And who's behind this railroad development? Well, that would be the Clearwater Development Company, run by some investors from back east, but their local representative is... Crawford's voice trailed off as he realized what he was saying. Is what, Sheriff? Is Mayor Blackwood, Crawford finished quietly. The silence in the jailhouse was profound. Morrison could hear the angry voices outside growing louder, demanding that the ranger stop interfering with local justice and let them finish what they'd started. But inside the small stone building, the truth was beginning to emerge like dawn breaking over the mountains. Sheriff Crawford, Morrison said formally, I'm going to need you to accompany me to the Hamilton place so we can conduct a proper investigation. And I think we'd better have a talk with Mayor Blackwood about his business interests and his whereabouts last night. Crawford looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing on quicksand. "Captain, you're not suggesting that the mayor—" "I mean, he's a respected citizen, a pillar of the community." "I'm not suggesting anything," Morrison replied. "I'm following the evidence wherever it leads. That's what real lawmen do." As they prepared to leave the jailhouse, Timothy called out from his cell, "Captain Morrison, if I really am innocent like you think, what happens to the people who were ready to hang me without a trial? What happens to folks who were willing to see a boy die just to make themselves feel better?" Morrison paused at the door, considering the question that went to the heart of everything wrong with mob justice. "Son, sometimes the hardest part of wearing a badge isn't catching the guilty. It's protecting the innocent from the people who are supposed to be on the side of justice." Outside, the crowd was growing larger and more restless, their voices carrying the ugly edge of people who'd been denied their entertainment. But Captain James Morrison had faced down worse odds than an angry mob, and he'd be damned if he'd let an innocent boy hang just to satisfy their bloodlust. The investigation was just beginning, but already Morrison could see the shape of the real crime beginning to emerge. And when the truth finally came to light, he suspected it would reveal corruption that went far deeper than one murdered homesteader and one convenient scapegoat. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of courage and family. Hit that subscribe button to never miss our incredible true tales. By the time Captain Morrison and Sheriff Crawford reached the Hamilton homestead, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the Texas landscape. The small farmhouse sat silent and empty, its windows dark and its doors sealed with the kind of quiet that only comes to places where violence has been done. Morrison dismounted and began his examination of the scene, with the methodical thoroughness of a man who'd learned that the devil was always in the details. What he found in the first few minutes of searching made him wonder how Sheriff Crawford had ever managed to keep his badge. "Sheriff," Morrison called from the kitchen doorway. "Come look at this." Crawford approached reluctantly, already sensing that whatever the ranger had discovered would further undermine his hasty conclusion about Timothy's guilt. Morrison pointed to the broken window beside the kitchen door. "Glass is scattered on the inside of the house, which means it was broken from outside. And look here," he indicated scuff marks on the windowsill. "Boot prints where someone climbed through." "Could have been the boy," Crawford said weakly. "Could have been. Except Timothy told us he came in through the front door when he heard the commotion. And these boot prints are size 11 or 12. What size boots does Timothy wear?" Crawford looked down at his own feet, then back at the evidence. "Maybe a 7 or 8. He's still growing." Morrison continued his examination, finding more evidence that painted a clear picture of what had really happened. Overturned furniture in the kitchen showed signs of a violent struggle between Hamilton and multiple attackers. Muddy footprints from 3 different pairs of boots led from the broken window to the bedroom where the cash box had been kept. "Captain," Crawford said quietly, "I think I owe that boy an apology." "You owe him more than that," Morrison replied grimly. "You nearly let an innocent child hang because you were too lazy or too scared to do your job properly." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the kitchen window, Morrison could see 3 riders approaching the house. Mayor Blackwood flanked by 2 men who matched the descriptions Sarah Mackenzie had given of the mysterious riders from the night before. Morrison motioned for Crawford to stay quiet and positioned himself where he could observe without being seen. What he heard in the next few minutes would provide the final pieces of the puzzle. "I told you idiots to be more careful," Blackwood was saying as they dismounted. "Having that boy hanged for Hamilton's murder was supposed to solve our problems, not create new ones." The largest of the 3 men, whom Morrison now recognized as Vance, spat in the dust. "How were we supposed to know there'd be a Texas Ranger in town? Plan was simple enough. Kill Hamilton, take his money to make it look like robbery, and let the orphan boy take the blame." "Well, your simple plan has turned into a disaster," Blackwood snapped. "That Ranger's asking questions, and it won't be long before he figures out the connection between Hamilton's death and our railroad deal." The thin man, whom Morrison assumed was Carson, shifted nervously in his saddle. "Maybe we should just cut our losses and get out of town. There'll be other opportunities." "We're not running," Blackwood said firmly. "We've put too much money into this railroad development to walk away now. Hamilton's death was supposed to clear the last obstacle to our plans. Without his land, the railroad can't build the depot where we need it." Morrison had heard enough. He stepped out of the house, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Gentlemen, I think you might want to step down from those horses and put your hands where I can see them." The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. Vance went for his gun, but Morrison's Colt was already in his hand and speaking with authority. The big man's weapon spun away into the dust as he clutched his shattered wrist. Howling with pain and rage, Carson was smarter than his partner and raised his hands immediately, recognizing that he was facing a professional who wouldn't hesitate to shoot. But Mayor Blackwood seemed paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his carefully laid plans. "Morrison," he said, his voice carrying desperate authority, "you don't understand what you're interfering with. This railroad development will bring prosperity to Clearwater, jobs for hundreds of people. Hamilton was just one stubborn old man standing in the way of progress." "Progress," Morrison repeated, his voice cold as winter steel. "That what you call murdering an innocent man and framing a child for the crime?" Sheriff Crawford finally found his courage and drew his own weapon, covering Carson while Morrison kept Vance and Blackwood under control. "Mayor, you're under arrest for the murder of Ezra Hamilton and conspiracy to commit fraud." "You can't prove anything," Blackwood said desperately. "It's your word against mine, and I'm a respected citizen of this community." Morrison smiled grimly and pulled a small device from his vest pocket. "Actually, Mayor, it's your own words that'll convict you. This little recording machine has been documenting your confession for the past 5 minutes. New invention from back east, very useful for capturing evidence." The fight went out of Blackwood like air from a punctured balloon. He'd been undone by his own arrogance and the kind of technological advancement he claimed to represent. 2 hours later, back in Clearwater, Captain Morrison unlocked Timothy's cell and stepped aside to let the boy walk free. Outside, the crowd that had gathered for a hanging was dispersing in confused murmurs, their bloodlust unsatisfied and their certainties shaken. Timothy stood in the doorway of the jailhouse, blinking in the afternoon sunlight like a man emerging from a cave. "Captain Morrison, I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't come along when you did, you don't need to thank me, son. I was just doing my job." Morrison placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "But I will say this. You showed more courage and dignity in the face of death than most grown men ever manage. Don't let this town's shame become yours." Sarah Mackenzie was waiting outside, her face glowing with relief and vindication. "Timothy, I've spoken with the school board. They've agreed to offer you a position as assistant librarian while you continue your education. It comes with a small salary and lodging in the schoolhouse." Timothy's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than despair. "You mean I won't have to sleep in barns anymore? I'll have a real job, a real place to belong." "You'll have more than that," Morrison said. "You'll have the respect of every honest person in this territory. Word will spread about what happened here today, about how a boy faced down a lynch mob with nothing but truth and courage. That's the kind of reputation that opens doors and creates opportunities." As the three of them stood outside the jailhouse, watching Mayor Blackwood and his accomplices being loaded into a prison wagon bound for Austin, Timothy asked the question that had been troubling him since his ordeal began. "Captain Morrison, how do you keep believing in justice when you see how easy it is for good people to turn bad? How do you keep faith in the law when you see how quick folks are to abandon it?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, thinking about all the injustices he'd witnessed, all the times when the system had failed and innocent people had suffered. Finally, he spoke with the wisdom of a man who'd spent his life walking the thin line between order and chaos. "Timothy, I learned a long time ago that justice isn't something that happens automatically. It's something that has to be fought for, protected and preserved by people who believe it's worth the effort. Every time we stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, we make the world a little bit better for the next person who needs protection. 3 months later, Timothy Walsh received a letter from the territorial capital informing him that he'd been accepted into the state university on a full scholarship. The letter was signed by Judge Harrison, who'd been following the case and was impressed by the young man's character and determination. Timothy would go on to become a lawyer himself, specializing in defending the rights of children and the powerless. He would never forget the morning when a Texas Ranger cut the rope that was meant to end his life, proving that sometimes justice comes not from courts or laws, but from individual men and women who choose to do what's right, regardless of the consequences. Captain James Morrison continued to serve the people of Texas for another 20 years, becoming a legend in law enforcement circles for his unwavering integrity and his protection of the innocent. He never spoke publicly about the day he saved a boy from a lynch mob, considering it simply part of his duty as a peace officer. But in the annals of Texas Ranger history, the case would be remembered as a perfect example of what happens when trained law enforcement meets mob justice, and why the badge means nothing without the courage to stand between the innocent and those who would destroy them. The rope had been cut, but more than that, the bonds of prejudice and fear that had nearly claimed an innocent life had been severed as well. And in their place grew something stronger, the understanding that real justice isn't about satisfying crowds or maintaining order, but about protecting the truth and ensuring that every person, regardless of their station in life, receives the fair treatment that all human beings deserve. Thank you for watching this incredible story of courage, justice, and standing up for what's right. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to never miss our amazing true stories that will touch your heart and inspire your soul. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today.